I don't know how many of you are familiar with the vibraphone. You're all music people, so you surely at least know what it is. I've spent most of my life explaining it to people who say, "Oh, you're a musician, what do you play?" And I say the vibraphone, and they look at me, you know, like I'm from Mars. But it's really like a piano. It's not a percussion instrument as such, when we use sticks like the drummer does. But we have that in common with hockey and other things. It looks like a piano when you play it, and that's how I think. I'm going to play a song for you written by Antonio Carlos Jobim, the famous Brazilian composer. It's called O Grande Amor. Thanks very much. Now, this is a business class. By the way, does everybody here in this room have a gig this weekend? I mean, that was amazing. How many announcements you all made. Go to it. See if I can get this to come up here. Unblack the screen. That'll help. There we go. I'm going to start off just talking a little bit about what's going on in our world, the music business. And then we can talk about anything else you're interested in as well. I can't really see you too well. It would help, actually, if some of the house lights were up a bit. Right now, it's like I'm talking to a blacked out room. So if you did put your hand up, I wouldn't know it. So there, beautiful. Oh, have to wake everybody up. Sorry. Okay, well, this is what's happened to the record business over the last decade. And because so much of our career depends on the record business, it's certainly an important thing to put your attention on. As you can see, the record industry peaked about 10 years ago at about $15 billion worth of record sales. And it's been steadily going down every year since then. We're now at 6.3 billion, and the projection by Forrester Analysis, a company that does a lot of projecting in business areas, is that by 2012 it'll be about 5 billion and stabilized there. Why they think that, I don't know, but that's the prediction. Now, to put that in perspective, take a look down here. The latest figures we have are 2008. Books sold 24 billion. Movies did $32 billion in business, 2/3 of it in DVD sales. Games came from out of nowhere over the last decade, 22 billion. That's where the money has been going to. We're competing with other forms of entertainment, is what it comes down to. And you're probably all part of this as well. You all buy games and DVDs and so on. We don't have, this nice little market to ourselves. And a few other things happen. When CD sales came along in the 1990s, late 80s into the 90s, there was a golden period for the record companies. Everybody was replacing their vinyl collections with CDs that had been released of their favorite records, and so everybody went out and bought a lot of CDs. That wave has passed, and now it's harder and harder to sell CDs because we don't have that factored into it. Half of all CDs by the way, are not sold at record stores anymore. They're sold at places like Walmart, Target, and Best Buy, and that will continue to be the case as the record stores keep closing. In the past 2 years, 1,200 record stores have closed, including even several of the big chains that were dominant in the business. Everybody's kind of just given up and let Target and Walmart and so on have it. The single largest seller of records in the United States is Walmart. And of course, they stock records primarily that sell well. They make no effort to stock everything. The days of that are pretty much gone. I'm trying to think I'm blanking out on the name of the chain that was very popular in the 90s, and their policy was to try to carry every record that was in current release. So if you went into their mega stores with 3 and 4 floors of records, you could be likely to find just about anything you were looking for. They don't exist anymore. Downloads are gradually increasing, and when it says 30% of total sales, that's sales by iTunes and so on. That's not illegal downloads. This is the ones that they track. And that figure keeps going up every year. So increasingly, we're moving away from CDs and hard copies of things, and people are buying it online and downloading, and we're leaving behind the tradition of people buying albums, moving toward people buying singles. So the record companies made a big push in the 1950s to get people to buy albums instead of singles. They eventually stopped releasing singles, and you could only buy the albums, and now we've gone back to that earlier format. Just to put in perspective what $6 billion is like, that's our entire record industry. A single major insurance company like Prudential or whatever, they did $20 billion in sales last year. One company. Our entire industry is $6 billion. We're a small operation these days and getting smaller. We're more visible because it's the entertainment field. People don't pay much attention to insurance companies, but everybody listens to music and buys some records and so on. So there's a glamour. You see the Grammys every year and so on. So people are more aware of the record business, but it's definitely shrinking. And the question now is, what does that mean for the future? I wanted to actually mention one more thing, in terms of reasons why it has dropped down so far and steadily, besides the surge of CD sales past now and competing with other media. Pricing. Normally, when you're competing with something else and the something else is taking away your business, you lower your prices to become more competitive. But what did the record companies do? They said, no, well, if we're going to sell fewer records, we'll have to charge more in order to have the same profit left over at the end of the process. So they kept raising the prices. And now, it got to the point where you can buy DVDs for as much or less even than CDs that come out. And people think, well, wait a minute, with the DVD I get music and a picture. And with the CD, it's just the music. It doesn't make sense. So the record companies made a big mistake. They thought they could take advantage of the marketplace and think short term, but it was a big mistake on their part. It encouraged illegal downloading because the prices were no longer comfortable for people. And by the time they figured it out, it was a little too late to stop the slide that's been going on. As for what the future holds, I think it's anybody's guess. One thing that seems apparent is we cannot be quite as dependent on the record industry as we used to. Depending on what field of music you're in, this is an interesting comparison. In some fields, you don't make a lot of money from records, classical, jazz. You make most of your money from touring. Typical jazz musician who, let's say, the total income for the year is $100,000, I'll just pick a round figure, might make $10,000 of that from records and the other $90,000 from their live engagements. That almost reverses for a lot of pop groups, rock groups, who spend so much on their touring expenses that they break even. That's all they try to do on tours in many cases. But they're selling large numbers of records, so they make their money on the record sales instead. These days, that equation is changing because even for the large artists, the record sales numbers are lower and lower each year. I was looking at the figures for last year and noticed that big sales were, 2 million copies, 2.5 million, 1.5 million. They used to easily record 8-10 million copies of major hit records during the year. The numbers are definitely lower, and people are now having to make more money off of their touring and their peripheral things like merchandise sales and so on, which 30, 40 years ago, no one even thought of selling T-shirts. But nowadays, that's actually a big piece of what many artists manage to earn over the course of the year. I think, sorry for this, my breathing here. I think that there's a new business model that's gradually trying to take shape. We're in the midst of the turmoil now and have been for the last decade or so. But my own sense, and no one really knows what it's going to be, what it's going to look like. But probably 10 years from now, we'll look back and see what it is. The best approach right now is to remain flexible and adaptable so that as you see business trends either fading or growing, you can take part in them. Certainly, the whole approach to getting a record deal and getting recorded has changed a lot. It's no longer just a handful of major labels that everybody aims at and who control most of the business. It's now a lot of independent companies, a lot of people doing it themselves, and so on. In fact, the whole role of the record company has changed drastically. I'm sure you've been told this already. I mean, up until the last decade, record companies provided some things that you couldn't get elsewhere. Distribution worldwide to get your record out there. They provided the funding for you to make the record in the first place. They essentially loan you the money to make the record, and you pay it back out of your royalties. And if you don't make enough royalties, you don't have to pay them back. It's not a bad deal. And they provide publicity and exposure in the press and so on. Well, most of that is no longer strictly something that only record companies can provide. Now, because of the internet and so on, we can sell our records ourselves on our websites. The only thing we can't do is as easily as finance our records. So the hundreds of thousands of dollars it takes to make a really well-made record has to come from somewhere, and people are cutting corners. They're making records that are of less quality because they've only got $50,000 that they've borrowed from their uncle to finance the record with. So they do it at home and in a cheaper studio and with less time available and so on. It's hurting the artistic level of records to some extent. But in the end, I believe that there will be a business model that will survive, and that's where all of us that are in the business need to be. The one part of the equation, I continue to tell myself this, maybe it's just wishful thinking, is that they will still need musicians. There's various other aspects of the business that may no longer be relevant, but someone still has to play the music. It can't all be done by computers. So I figure the safest place to be is to be a musician that is successful in live performances and connects with people when you perform, and you'll be the last part of the profession to become irrelevant. And I know most of you are musicians here, so you're better off than you might think. Okay, I hope that wasn't too depressing. Just trying to be honest and so on. Questions about anything to do with this or anything else? I mean, some of you are aspiring jazz musicians, I presume. Yeah. You know, did you hear that? Why has it not been figured out yet? For a long time, it was great resistance on the part of the business itself, the record industry. Just did not want to give up a business model that had worked so well for them for so many decades that they couldn't look past it. They were really in denial. I remember saying to my record company back in the mid-'80s, or late '80s, I just signed with GRP then. I remember telling the president of the company when we were having dinner that I had a prediction, which was that eventually we wouldn't be buying records at the store or keeping them at home and on discs. The CD was brand new at that time. But I said eventually we would have a box that would sit on our hi-fi system at home, and all our records would be stored in that box. I was right except for one thing, the size of the box. It's now, an iPod. It's much smaller than I imagined it was going to be. But no one was, believing that this was where we were headed. Even though I could see the technology, once I saw you could keep a record as a file on a computer, I said, well, that's where it's going to end up in one way or another. We're going to get down to this, because for a long time, the improvements in records was to increase the quality up until the invention of the cassette. And from that point on, the incentive has been to make it more convenient. People right now, even it's a step downward to go from a CD to an MP3 file. You probably know the quality isn't as good. It doesn't seem to matter to anybody except a handful of recording engineers and audiophiles. The general public is real happy with the MP3 and the fact that they can carry it in their shirt pocket and so on. So again, the industry misread it. They kept thinking if we would come out with quad or come out with surround or come out whatever, everybody would go back to buying hardware and disc again. It's not going to happen. Convenience has won out, and convenience means we don't need as much product. So the record industry is just now waking up to all these factors and trying to figure out how to transform themselves. And illegal downloading has complicated it. Thank goodness for iTunes, because at least that solidified things quite a bit when Apple came out with that. I guess the answer to your question is some things take more time than you would think it would be necessary. And if you have the answer, we'd like to hear it. Excuse me? Well, I still didn't hear you, but it's. Only. Well, that's the way they teach it down here, huh?
Guys, use the microphones if you have questions. But these old farts over here have had some of his LPs from a long time ago, and you guys weren't around 20 some odd years ago, but the duos that he's done with both Chick Corea and Pat Metheny are phenomenal. And you had just mentioned a little bit about you're going to be touring. Could you just tell us a little bit about working with both Chick Corea and Pat Metheny and the differences and the similarities between the two and how you guys work together? Okay. Especially you're all keyboard,
Yeah, well,
and
Keith
Jarrett,
also.
Yeah.
I started playing with Chick Corea in 1972. We were on a jazz festival, not playing together, in Germany. There were various musicians on the festival, and the promoter decided he would like to have a jam session at the end of the festival. So he went around to all the players that night, and it turned out the only two people that said okay were me and Chick. So we had a laugh about that and decided to go ahead and play a duet. And it went over pretty well. And it turned out the head of his record label at the time was there and said, oh, you guys, you should make a whole record of this. And we thought he was, just carried away. I mean, who would want to hear a whole hour of just vibes and piano? But he kept after us, and about 6 months later, we agreed. We went back to Europe and recorded an album together called Crystal Silence that we thought would disappear quietly into the ether. It came out, and then we started getting calls to do concerts. That was now 37 years ago, and we've made 7 records, won 5 Grammys together, and still play every year a few tours. It seems to have worked out. We never planned it. We didn't expect it to happen, but it's turned out to be a great success for us. We discovered we have a rapport that works for the two of us. If with every musician you play with, you have some level of rapport. And let's say on a scale of 1 to 10, it might be a 3 with somebody, it might be an 8 with someone else, and so on. I mean, you have some degree of empathy with everyone you play with. With the two of us, meet from the very beginning, it was like instant mind reading. We could just tell what the other guy was going to play the next phrase. And we made the whole record in 3 hours. Every tune was a first take except for one. And we did 2 takes on that one. That now has been one of the mainstays of both of our careers. With Pat Metheny, Pat actually approached me when he was a teenager. I was playing a college jazz festival in Kansas, and he walked up to me and asked if he could play with me, and I said no, because I didn't know him at all, and he was just like a 17-year-old kid. But he was persistent, and finally we did play one song together that night on this college concert, and he played pretty well for a 17-year-old, and he was living in Florida at the time, and my advice to him was move somewhere that had a real active jazz scene, New York or Boston probably. So a few months later he moved to Boston, where I lived also, and a year or so later, he joined my band and played with my band for 4 years, and then started his own band. And we still play together every now and then, do a record and some more touring and so on. So I think with every musician you connect with, it's a different dynamic. Sometimes you're the same age, sometimes there's an age difference between you. I actually like playing with young players a lot. They do unpredictable things and challenge you all the time. It keeps me from getting stuck in routines. And so I actually prefer young players being around a lot. It's one of the reasons I like teaching during the years I was doing that a lot. Yes?
How do you compete in the market playing jazz and playing vibraphone?
Repeat that. I didn't catch the first part.
How do you compete in this market of selling records as a jazz musician and specifically as a vibraphonist?
Well, the vibraphone is an instrument that's only visible in jazz. And as such, you know, that's, thank goodness I'm a jazz musician or I wouldn't have much work. But I have to become a success in spite of being a vibraphone player. No band needs a vibes player. And that's one of the things you learn early on when you play one of these kinds of less common instruments. Every band needs a bass player and a drummer and so on. Nobody needs a vibes player. So you have to sell yourself to the other musicians, first of all, to convince them that they should have this clumsy, awkward instrument to travel around with and all in their band, because you're good enough that they want you as a player, in spite of the fact that you play this thing. So that's the position I think I find myself in. In terms of staying successful in the business, you just got to sell X number of records and be able to draw a crowd where you play, and that's true whatever instrument you play. It's a little easier if you're a guitar player or something, or a saxophone player or a singer. People are more familiar with it, but you build a fan base over time. I played the first 4 years of my career, I played in other people's bands, other jazz groups, George Shearing's band for a year, Stan Getz's band for 3 years, and that got me to the point where I had enough of a following to start my own band. And people knew me well enough from having seen me as a sideman to start coming to my gigs as well. And I think it's important also, if you're going to have a successful career, you need to stand out from the crowd. If you sound generically like lots of other players, you're not going to get noticed as well. And that's something we don't have much control over. You can't will yourself to be different. I'll give you an example. We all know people who are, we call them characters. They're funny, they're quirky, they do surprising things. We remember them. Some of them end up as comedians on TV, for instance. You have to be the equivalent as a musician. Your music has to strike people as being noticeable, different, unique, and so then they'll remember you in particular. And as I say, you can't manufacture that. It's your personality that you're born with and that you've evolved over the years. You are what you are. And if your playing is unique, it'll serve you much better than if it turns out to be kind of similar to lots of other players. That's a harder sell.
Artistic value of modern music, or I'm not sure if it was value, but artistic. You're saying what makes modern music artistic value? What makes it lower now than it used to be? You're saying something about how the modern the formula that we're in right now, at least, or the changing formula,
Oh, well,
You mentioned something about
I'm not sure if I got your question right or
I didn't
not.
really say it. I hit it in my head like 100 times.
But we tend to separate in our minds kinds of music between music that we think of as artistic music. Normally that encompasses classical and jazz, and commercial music, rock, pop, rap, country, etc. And these lines are gray. There's little crossovers here and there. They blend back and forth. But essentially, the art musics, in a funny way, survive longer than the commercial music. If you can make it as a jazz musician, you'll probably be a successful jazz musician until you're 85. If you make it as a pop musician, your career may be over in 5 years. Now, we do have more longevity in pop musicians now, people like Sting and Billy Joel and Elton John and so on, who are now approaching 60 and still are successful. That's fairly recent. But in the art kinds of music, there is a longevity that's involved. You establish a very loyal following that tends to stay with you, for years and years and years. In the commercial field, you make more money quickly, but it tends to be very fickle. Styles change completely, and suddenly a whole new thing is popular, and your band is now passé, and it's over, and so on. So I don't think the art factor in music really changes that much. Someone made the comment that art forms don't die. They keep evolving and going on. And every decade or so, some misguided critic writes an article about jazz is dead. They've been saying that since the 40s. I don't think so. If anything, the jazz audience is actually numerically bigger now than it was when I started out in the business. I made my first record in 1960, and typically in that era, if you sold 5,000 to 10,000 copies, you were successful. And if you played mostly in small clubs for 100, 150 people a night. So in the course of a week, you might play for, if you're lucky, 1,000 people. Now, and a hit record was to sell 50,000 records in jazz. Now, your target is just to say the record did decently. The target is 25,000, 30,000 copies. And a hit record is 200,000, over 100 at least, or 200 or 250. And we play concerts more now. So I'm in a single audience is 1,500 people, 2,000 people, 3,000 people. And I hardly ever play clubs anymore. Records are also, and gigs also, are now available worldwide. 40, 50 years ago, it was mostly here just in the US. And as a jazz musician, didn't work that much outside the country or sell records that much outside the country. So there's a much bigger pie, is what I'm saying, than there was years ago. So I've discovered that if you ask a jazz musician whether things are going good or going bad, the answer will depend on how much they personally are working. If their band is working steadily, they're going to say, yeah, things are going great. The record's selling okay. We just got back from the European tour and so on. If you ask the guy who's having trouble getting work, he'll say, oh, man, it's dead. The festivals are all closing down. The clubs aren't happening anymore. Both of those stories are true for those individuals. But if you look at the actual numbers, I'm glad I'm a jazz musician now as opposed to in the 1930s or 40s. Question, sir? Oh, no, well, you have the mic.
All right.
we can't hear him.
Yeah, I was wondering, I think you mentioned earlier that the trend is sort of heading towards a lot of people doing the records on their own. And I've seen a lot of friends, sort of people that are a little older than me, that are also making them completely on their own, like funding it themselves. And I was wondering, like, once you have the product done, say you've done it without a label, and you have everything copyrighted and it's all packaged and everything, do you have any suggestions if you don't have your own, manager or booking agent or publicist about how to get an awareness out for it to maybe not quite on the scale of if it was on Blue Note or ECM or something, but like to get an awareness, to get reviews, and
yeah,
and
this
things
is
like
the
that.
big challenge, and it's kind of a catch-22 kind of situation. If you try to go to an agent or a manager who actually is established in the business, the first thing they say to you is, well, do you have a record deal? And you say no. And if you go to the record company, they'll say, well, do you have a manager and an agent? And you say, well, no, not yet. So you keep knocking on both of those doors until you get through one of them. And then that opens the other door ultimately. So if you've made a record on your own, then the next thing to do is try to use it at the entry level, is try to use it to get gigs. One of the first uses of a record that you've made is to go to club owners and concert bookers and try to get work, because the first thing club owners will ask you is, have you made a record? Do you have a record? Something I can listen to, whatever. And if you've got an actual CD with a cover and looks reasonably professional, even if the label is, did it myself, at least to the club owner, okay, there's some legitimacy here. We know these people can, got it together far enough, and at least to make a recording, and go from there. Most record companies select new artists in two ways. It's not when you send the record to them. That never works. Either someone who is connected in the business says to them, I've got a group you need to hear. So if it's an already existing successful manager, agent, press person, whatever in the business, or another famous musician even, goes to a label and says, this new sax player, you should check him out. They're going to check the guy out and see what they think. The other way is they hear somebody themselves in person. Record company executives go to festivals, they go to concerts, they go to gigs. They're always kind of hoping they're going to discover the next Wynton Marsalis or the next Pat Metheny or whatever, and get in on the ground floor with building a major artist. So get yourself heard as much as you can is the first rule. And I want to address one more thing about this making the records yourself. There's a subtle but important difference between what a $300,000 budget will get you in terms of quality of a record versus doing it in your garage. Now, I know that with Pro Tools and everything else, you can make a pretty decent sounding record by yourself at home. But there are small, subtle differences in a well-produced record in a major studio that the individual listener can't pinpoint those differences. But there's a sense, when you listen to this record, it feels so much fuller and richer and draws me in versus the homemade one. And that's what we're losing as we go increasingly to making the records on the cheap. We're losing a kind of quality in the finished product that is a loss artistically to me. Anyone else? Okay.
When I think vibraphone, I think of Mike Dillon and Les Claypool's band, when he just does all this crazy stuff. But clearly, you've been doing it for a lot longer, and he just uses what you probably made up. Are you okay with that?
Yeah. We all share what we do. There are some things that we copyright, some things that we own, but how you play an instrument, yeah, that's everybody deserves their best chance to do it as well as they can. And if they see me play, otherwise I'd be playing behind a curtain, so you wouldn't see how I did it. Plus I taught for years and showed people how to do it. Doesn't mean they're going to, do it as well as I do. Maybe they will. But frankly, if they're that talented, they're going to do it with or without my help. Talent finds its level wherever it happens to be. And so it doesn't bother me at all. In fact, I'm thrilled if I see somebody stealing some of my stuff. I'm thinking, oh, I'm having an influence here. It feels good, actually.
On that note, Gary, is there any way we can impose on you to have another tune? Yeah.
All right.
this opportunity to thank Gary. I want everybody to.
See? Losing my touch. Okay, let's see.